The projector was still casting my data across the screen when the chairs began to scrape backward. All of them. 12 executives stood at the same time, almost perfectly synchronized, as if someone had quietly counted down in their heads. The sudden movement sucked the air out of the room. My voice stopped mid-sentence, while the slide behind me displayed the quality failure reports I had spent weeks verifying. Ethan Calder, the company's chief operations officer, didn't even look at the screen. "This presentation is unnecessary," he said flatly. His tone carried the lazy confidence of someone who had never once expected consequences. "Before we continue, allow me to pause for a moment. If this story has captivated you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? And what's the temperature where you live right now? I'm happy to make friends from all over the world." Okay. Now let's get back to that room. Around the table, expensive suits shifted as tablets closed and folders snapped shut. The entire leadership team began moving toward the door in a tight formation. No questions, no discussion, just silence. "Our safety data contradicts the shipping approvals," I said, forcing the words out evenly. "If these units fail in hospitals, customers are satisfied," interrupted Marissa Holt, the vice president of operations. Her smile was polished and unbothered. "Perhaps the issue," she added lightly, "is your interpretation of the numbers." One by one, they walked past me. The sound of leather shoes on the polished floor echoed louder than it should have. I stood there beside the screen, still pointing at the evidence no one had even bothered to read. Richard Vale, the company's CFO, was the last to leave. He paused at the doorway and glanced back at the glowing slides that filled the darkening room. Then he reached for the light switch. "Don't waste your time finishing," he said quietly. "No one's going to read your report." The lights clicked off. The room fell into half-darkness, illuminated only by the harsh glow of the projector and the evidence they had just walked away from. For 30 seconds. I stood there alone. My pulse slowed. The humiliation settled into something colder, because the truth was, I had expected exactly this reaction, and when I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I had saved weeks earlier, I spoke 7 words that would change everything. They did exactly what you predicted. As the story progresses, some details will be dramatized, with a touch of creative storytelling and the aid of artificial intelligence to highlight hidden lessons and emotions. I hope the story touches your heart. If not, that's perfectly fine too. Perhaps tonight is simply a good night to pause, rest, and return another time. "They did exactly what you predicted," I said into the phone. There was a short pause on the other end of the line. "All of them," the woman asked. "Every single one. And you have it recorded?" "Yes," I replied. "Every word." Another pause followed, longer this time. I could almost hear her thinking through the implications. "Good," she finally said. "Then everything starts now." Her name was Elena Ward, senior investigator for the Federal Regulatory Division that oversaw companies like ours. I had first contacted her 3 months earlier, after discovering something I couldn't ignore. At the time, I had hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. "My team will need a few hours," Elena continued calmly. "Stay in the building if you can. Act normal. I can do that." The call ended. I leaned back in my chair and looked up at the glowing presentation still projected across the wall. Rows of charts, incident reports, failed safety tests, equipment designed for hospitals, equipment that had never passed proper validation, yet somehow it had still been approved. 3 months earlier, when I joined Hallbrook Dynamics, one of the country's largest industrial equipment manufacturers, I believed I had been hired to improve their quality systems. That was what they told me. "Your reputation for fixing broken processes is exactly what we need," the COO, Ethan Calder, had said during my final interview. At the time, I believed him, but the deeper I dug into their internal records, the clearer the pattern became. Test failures quietly modified, customer complaints buried, incident reports rewritten. And one more thing, my predecessor, Daniel Rhodes, hadn't resigned for medical reasons the way HR claimed. He had been pushed out because he discovered the same truth I had just uncovered. And this time, someone was finally ready to expose it. The first time something felt wrong at Hallbrook Dynamics. It wasn't a report, it was a look. 3 weeks into my new role as Quality Assurance Director. I was touring one of the primary testing labs. The room smelled faintly of machine oil and disinfectant, the kind of sterile scent companies like to associate with precision and safety. A senior technician named Lena Ortiz walked beside me, explaining the validation process for the hospital equipment our company manufactured. Her answers were technically correct, but they sounded rehearsed. When we reached the testing station, I asked a simple question. How often do you re-verify failure tolerances before final approval? Lena hesitated. Not long, just long enough. Her eyes flicked toward a small security camera mounted high in the corner of the room. Then she smiled. The way employees smile when they are repeating something they've been trained to say. We follow established company protocols. Later that evening, back in my office, I began reviewing archived test logs. At first, nothing obvious stood out. Then I noticed something strange. The numbers didn't match. Manufacturing outputs showed failure rates that were significantly higher than the final validation reports, but the equipment had still been approved for shipment. At first, I assumed it was a documentation error, so I asked my team. The response was silence. 5 people in the room, 5 sets of eyes staring at the table. No one spoke. The next morning, I requested a private meeting with Ethan Calder, our COO. He listened patiently while I explained the inconsistencies. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled. Laura, he said calmly, sometimes the real problem isn't the numbers. He folded his hands on the desk. Sometimes the problem is how people choose to interpret them. That afternoon, a notification appeared in my company account, a bonus payment I had never requested, and no explanation attached. That was the moment I realized something important. They weren't trying to fix the system. They were trying to control it. I declined the bonus the same afternoon it appeared. No message, no explanation. Just a quiet rejection through the internal payroll system. The following morning, my calendar filled with a meeting request from Marissa Holt, Vice President of Operations. Her office sat on the executive floor, a level most employees rarely visited. The moment I walked in, I noticed something. The door closed softly behind me. Marissa didn't immediately speak. Instead, she studied me with a polite, measured smile while sliding a thin folder across her glass desk. I've reviewed the concerns you raised about our testing procedures, she said. Her tone sounded reassuring, almost sympathetic. I opened the folder. Inside was a revised employment contract, a salary increase, a larger bonus structure, and a single additional clause printed in bold near the bottom, a confidentiality expansion agreement. I looked up at her. What exactly is this? I asked. Marissa leaned back slightly in her chair. Laura, every large company operates within a certain flexibility, she said carefully. Regulators understand that. Investors understand that. Her finger tapped lightly on the signature line. We simply need our leadership team aligned. I flipped through the pages slowly. Aligned with what I asked. Her smile widened slightly, with the understanding that not every irregularity requires escalation. There it was. Not a correction, not an explanation, a warning. I closed the folder and placed it gently back on the desk. I'll need time to review it, I said. Of course, Marissa replied smoothly. But as I stood to leave, she added one final sentence. You have a promising career here. Laura. Her voice softened just enough to sound friendly. It would be unfortunate if unnecessary concerns created complications. That night, an anonymous email appeared in my inbox. Attached were internal safety reports, the original versions, the ones that had been altered, and at the bottom of the message, a single line Daniel Rhodes didn't leave voluntarily. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. I wanted time to review the files from the anonymous email before the rest of the office filled with noise and routine. The underground parking garage was mostly empty when I stepped out of my car. Concrete pillars, dim fluorescent lights, the quiet hum of ventilation fans. I had just locked my door when I heard someone call my name. Laura. I turned. Standing near the stairwell was Lena Ortiz, the technician who had shown me the testing lab weeks earlier. She looked different now. Nervous. Her eyes kept darting toward the entrance ramp as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. "You shouldn't be here yet," she said quickly. "What do you mean?" I asked. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "They're preparing to remove you." The words landed harder than I expected. "Baxter already drafted your termination paperwork," she continued. "They've been telling everyone your report is exaggerated, that you're trying to blame production for problems that don't exist." I studied her face. "Why are you telling me this for a moment?" She didn't answer. Then her expression hardened with quiet frustration. "Because Daniel tried to warn them too. Daniel Rhodes, my predecessor." "What happened to him?" I asked. Lena swallowed. "They threatened him with fraud charges, said his investigation violated internal protocols. Eventually, he signed a settlement agreement and disappeared. And the company told everyone he was sick." She nodded. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The distant sound of a car entering the garage echoed through the concrete structure. "You should be careful," Lena said softly. "They're expecting you to present today, but they've already decided how it ends." I leaned against the car door, considering everything she had said. Then I looked back at her. "Thank you for telling me." She gave a faint nod. But before she walked away, she added one last sentence. "They think they're about to destroy your career." Her eyes met mine for the first time without fear. "They have no idea what's coming." The meeting with the executive team was scheduled for late afternoon. Plenty of time for rumors to spread. By the time I stepped into the conference room, the atmosphere already felt staged. 12 members of the executive leadership team sat around the long glass table, each with a tablet or notebook neatly arranged in front of them. They weren't here to listen. They were here to perform. Ethan Calder leaned back in his chair as I connected my laptop to the projector. "Let's keep this brief," he said. "We all have busy schedules." The lights dimmed as my presentation appeared on the screen. Slide after slide documented the discrepancies I had discovered over the past 3 months. Failed safety tests, modified inspection reports, shipping approvals issued despite documented defects. For the first few minutes, no one interrupted, but no one took notes either. They simply watched me with the same polite indifference people use when waiting for something unpleasant to end. Then Marissa Holt exchanged a glance with Ethan. That was the signal. Moments later, the chairs scraped back, one after another. They stood up and walked out, exactly as Elena had predicted. What they didn't realize was that one slide was missing from the presentation. The most important one. The slide that connected the falsified safety reports to internal communications between executives, discussing how to bury incidents that could have triggered regulatory investigations. That evidence was stored somewhere else, somewhere much safer. After the door closed behind the last executive, I remained in the dim conference room for a few moments. Not angry, not surprised, just waiting. My phone buzzed quietly in my pocket. A message from Elena Ward. "Agents are on their way." I walked slowly out of the conference room and toward the elevators, across the office floor. Employees glanced up as I passed. Most assumed I had just been humiliated in front of the entire leadership team. In a way, they were right. But humiliation had never been the point, because in less than an hour, the same executives who had just walked out of that meeting would discover something they hadn't expected. They had just provided the final piece of evidence needed to bring down their entire operation. The lobby of Hallbrook Dynamics was unusually quiet that afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows, reflecting off the marble floor and the polished reception desk where 2 assistants whispered over their monitors. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. Inside, however, the clock was ticking. I stood near the elevators, pretending to scroll through my phone while keeping an eye on the main entrance. 3 months of preparation had led to this moment. Every document, every recorded conversation, every altered report, all of it had been carefully passed to Elena Ward and her team. At exactly 3:17 in the afternoon, the front doors opened. 4 people stepped inside, dark suits, serious expressions, and badges already visible. The lead investigator, Elena, walked straight to the reception desk without hesitation. Her voice carried clearly across the lobby. Federal Regulatory Enforcement Division, she announced. We have a warrant to access company records and conduct interviews with senior leadership. The receptionist froze for a split second. The entire lobby went silent. Then, everything exploded into motion. Phones appeared in employees' hands. Whispers spread through the room like wildfire. 2 agents headed directly for the elevators, while another began speaking with the building's security manager. Within minutes, the calm corporate atmosphere dissolved into controlled chaos. From across the lobby, I saw Ethan Calder emerge from a hallway near the executive offices. His face turned pale the moment he noticed the investigators. He strode quickly toward me, his voice low but sharp. What exactly have you done? Laura. I met his stare calmly. Exactly what you hired me to do, I replied. Protect the integrity of the company's safety standards. His jaw tightened. You've just destroyed this company. Behind him, Elena approached, holding a stack of documents. I'm afraid the company's problems began long before today, she said evenly. Her gaze moved from Ethan to me. Miss Price has agreed to assist our investigation. Around us, agents were already heading upstairs. The investigation had begun. And for the first time since I joined Hallbrook Dynamics, the executives were no longer in control. Within 20 minutes, the entire building had transformed. Agents from the Regulatory Enforcement Division moved through the executive floors with calm efficiency. Office doors opened. Computer systems were secured. Filing cabinets that had remained untouched for years were suddenly the center of attention. Employees stood in small clusters, whispering to each other while pretending to continue their work. No one was pretending very well. I was escorted to a smaller conference room where Elena and 2 investigators had already begun reviewing the evidence. A large monitor displayed folders of documents I had provided over the past 3 months, testing reports, email threads, internal approval logs, each piece connected to the same pattern. Deliberate concealment. Elena tapped one of the files on the screen. This email chain, she said, is particularly important. The message was from Richard Vale, the company's chief financial officer. It discussed an incident that had occurred at a hospital in Ohio nearly a year earlier. A malfunctioning device, a patient injury. Internal reports had confirmed the failure came from a manufacturing defect, but the official company response had blamed improper user operation. The email thread showed the truth. Executives had discussed how to rewrite the report before regulators saw it. One message from Ethan Calder stood out. We handled Cincinnati once. We'll handle it the same way again. Elena leaned back slightly. That sentence connects multiple incidents across 2 years. She explained, and it proves knowledge and intent. Across the building, investigators continued gathering records through the glass walls of the conference room. I watched as 2 agents escorted Richard Vale down the hallway toward another interview room. His confident expression from the previous day had vanished, replaced by something closer to disbelief. He glanced briefly toward the conference room where I sat. For a moment, our eyes met. That was the moment he understood. The woman they had dismissed as a minor inconvenience had just become the most important witness in the entire investigation, and this time the evidence wasn't going away. By the next morning, the entire company felt different. Security guards who didn't normally work in the building stood near the entrances. News vans waited outside the property gates. Employees whispered in the hallways as if the walls themselves might be listening. At 8 o'clock, an emergency board meeting was called. I was asked to attend. When I entered the boardroom, 20 people were already seated around the long walnut table. Members of the board, several attorneys, a few senior executives who hadn't yet been interviewed by investigators. 3 chairs were empty. The chairs usually occupied by Ethan Calder, Marissa Holt, and Richard Vale. The chairman of the board, Charles Davenport, gestured toward a seat near the presentation screen. "Miss Price," he said, "please begin." I connected my tablet to the room's display system. The lights dimmed. The same presentation that the executives had refused to watch the day before appeared again on the screen. But this time, no one walked out for the next 40 minutes. I explained everything: the altered safety reports, the suppressed equipment failures, the internal communications discussing how to avoid regulatory scrutiny. Board members leaned forward in their chairs as the scale of the deception slowly became clear. One director removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another stared silently at the screen, as if trying to process how something this serious had gone unnoticed for years. When I finished, the room was completely silent. Then one of the attorneys spoke quietly. "If these documents are verified, the company could face criminal liability." Chairman Davenport nodded slowly. "They will be verified," he said. He turned toward me. "Miss Price, thank you for bringing this forward." Outside the boardroom, investigators continued moving through the building. Inside the room, the realization finally settled across every face at the table. The company's leadership hadn't just made mistakes, they had built an entire system designed to hide them. And now that system was collapsing. The consequences arrived faster than anyone expected. By noon that same day, trading of Hallbrook Dynamics stock had been temporarily suspended while regulators reviewed the investigation. News reports began appearing across financial networks, each headline more severe than the last. Federal probe targets industrial equipment manufacturer. Executives under investigation for concealing safety failures inside the company. The leadership structure collapsed almost overnight. 9 executives submitted resignation letters before the end of the day. 2 were escorted from the building by investigators. Several more were preparing legal defenses. I watched most of it unfold from the quiet of my apartment that evening. The television displayed footage of reporters standing outside the same headquarters where I had worked only days earlier. But what mattered most wasn't the headlines. It was the truth finally becoming visible. For years, faulty equipment had been quietly shipped into hospitals and public facilities. Employees had been pressured into silence. Reports had been rewritten to protect profits instead of people. Now that silence was broken. The next morning, my phone rang. "Laura Price," a calm voice asked. "Yes. This is Dr. Harris from Memorial Medical Center. We've been following the investigation. Our safety board is looking for someone experienced in identifying compromised equipment systems." He paused. "Would you consider consulting with us?" I smiled for the first time in days. Sometimes the real victory isn't watching something corrupt collapse. Sometimes it's helping build something safer in its place. Standing in that dark conference room, I understood something many workplaces quietly ignore. Silence can become a system. Not because one person lies, but because many people decide it's easier not to question what they see. For a moment, I wondered what would have happened if I had simply signed the contract, accepted the bonus, and looked the other way. Many people would have. The pressure to stay quiet can be very real, but every system eventually depends on one person deciding not to play along anymore. In my case, the numbers on those reports weren't just data. They represented real people who trusted that the equipment protecting them was safe. That responsibility mattered more than my job title. So I'm curious, what would you do if you were in that situation? Would you stay silent? Or would you risk everything to speak up? And where in the world are you listening from today? If this story meant something to you, you can help it reach someone else who might need to hear it. A single like, comment, or subscription helps this channel share stories that remind people they're not alone when doing the right thing. Sometimes, even a small action can make a bigger difference than we expect. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.